Hi everyone. Yesterday we started talking about the different offerings that the Israelites brought to God while they were in the wilderness, while they were in the desert. And yesterday we talked specifically about the burnt offerings that we read about in Leviticus chapter 1. And we learned that the Israelites would offer a sacrifice of a pure, perfect bull or pigeon or goat or sheep or dove and would present that to God as they symbolically transferred their sins to this animal. This animal was sacrificed in their place for the forgiveness of their sins. And today we're going to talk about grain offerings. I want you to think for a second about your church and how your church may take up an offering. Maybe at the end of the service or at some point during the service, they take up an offering. I want you to think about why we in our churches, why they take up an offering. Just think for a second. So we give our offerings out of gratitude for what God has done for us. We recognize that what we have is not truly ours, that it is a gift from God, and we are to show our gratitude in giving back to God. And so that's what our offerings are, and that's what their grain offerings were back in the Old Testament. The Israelites would present their grain offerings as a way to show their thankfulness to God for all that He has given them. And so we're going to read Leviticus chapter 2, and we're going to think specifically about what they were presenting to God, what kind of grain. In Leviticus 1, we learned God was very specific with His instructions. They had to bring a male without defect, and He's going to be just as specific with His grain offerings. So we're going to use this chart again to answer the two questions. And we're going to focus on the second column here for Leviticus 2. And I want you to listen for and look, because I've bolded specific words in these passages of Scripture, of what the grain offering was, what were they actually specifically offering, and why they were offering this grain to God. Let's read. When anyone brings a grain offering to the Lord, their offering is to be of the finest flour. They are to pour olive oil on it, put incense on it, and take it to Aaron's sons, the priests. The priest shall take a handful of the flour and oil, together with all the incense, and burn this as a memorial portion on the altar, a food offering, an aroma pleasing to God, or to the Lord. The rest of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of the food offerings presented to the Lord. If you bring a grain offering baked in an oven, it is to consist of the finest flour, either thick loaves made without yeast and with olive oil mixed in, or thin loaves made without yeast and brushed with olive oil. If your grain offering is prepared on a griddle, it is to be made of the finest flour mixed with oil and without yeast. Are you starting to see a pattern here? Crumble it and pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. If your grain offering is cooked in a pan, it is to be made of the finest flour and some olive oil. Bring the grain offering made of these things to the Lord. Present it to the priest, who shall take it to the altar. He shall take out the memorial portion from the grain offering and burn it on the altar as a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. The rest of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of the food offerings presented to the Lord. Every grain offering you bring to the Lord must be made without yeast, For you are not to burn any yeast or honey in a food offering presented to the Lord. You may bring them to the Lord as an offering of the first fruits, but they are not to be offered on the altar as a pleasing aroma. Season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offerings. Add salt to all your offerings. If you bring a grain offering of first fruits to the Lord, offer crushed heads of new grain roasted in the fire. Put oil and incense on it. It is a grain offering. The priest shall burn the memorial portion of the crushed grain in the oil, together with all the incense, as a food offering presented to the Lord. So God was very specific in what they were to bring in their grain offering. But he was also very specific about what could be in the grain offering and what couldn't be in the grain offering. So for the what section of our chart, we want to write that they brought cakes or wafers made from fine flour without yeast. If you notice, I bolded the words fine flour and without yeast whenever it was spoken in the scripture. That was very important to God, that they made it with fine flour and without yeast. So remember, when bread is made without yeast, it's very flat, and it's like a wafer. You can kind of think of a saltine cracker. It doesn't rise, it's not like a loaf of bread, so it's flat. Now, why did they offer this grain offering? So we talked about that a little bit before we started reading the scripture. The grain offering was an offering of thanks for God's forgiveness of their sins and also God's goodness. So they wanted to, they've already made their burnt offering to get forgiveness of their sin. Now they're giving him another offering, and this one is to offer their thanks for his forgiveness and his goodness, for all that they've done for them. All right. So in our next Bible lesson, which will be on Monday, since you'll have chapel tomorrow, we will read through Leviticus 3, and we will talk about the fellowship offering.